The October morning in suburban Denver was crisp, with golden leaves scattered across our driveway like confetti that nobody had asked for. I remember the exact moment because I was standing in our kitchen holding that final mortgage statement. 0.20 balance when I heard Sarah's car pull into the garage. 23 years. 23 years of monthly payments, overtime shifts at the construction company, and skipping vacations to make extra payments on the principal. The 3-bedroom colonial with the wraparound porch wasn't much to look at from the outside, but it was ours, or so I thought. "Mike, we need to talk," Sarah said as she walked through the door, not even looking at the papers in my hands. Her voice had that cold, distant tone I'd been hearing more often lately. She was still in her work clothes, that sharp navy suit she wore to her job at the insurance company, but something was different. There was a finality in her posture, like she'd already made a decision I wasn't part of. "Actually, perfect timing," I said, trying to inject some warmth into the moment. "Look at this." I held up the mortgage statement. "We did it, Sarah. The house is officially ours." She glanced at the paper, and for just a second, I saw something flash across her face. Not joy, not relief. Something calculating. Something that made my stomach drop. "That's great, Mike. Really." She set her purse down on the counter with deliberate care. "But like I said, we need to talk. I've been thinking about us, about our future." I knew what was coming. You don't live with someone for 15 years without learning to read the signs. The late nights at the office that started 6 months ago, the way she'd started sleeping on her side of the bed like there was an invisible wall between us. How she'd stopped asking about my day, stopped sharing stories about hers. But the timing, the exact same day I paid off our house, that couldn't be a coincidence. "I filed for divorce this morning, Mike." She said it like she was discussing the weather. "I know this might come as a shock, but I've been unhappy for a long time. I think it's best if we split everything fairly and move on with our lives." The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. Not because I hadn't seen it coming, I had, but because of how calculated it felt, how perfectly timed. "You filed today?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Today, of all days?" "It wasn't planned that way, Mike. I know the timing seems convenient." I finished for her. "Sarah, we've been married for 15 years. We built this life together. And you choose today, the day our house is finally paid off, to tell me you want a divorce?" She had the decency to look uncomfortable, but she didn't deny it. "I want this to be amicable, Mike. We can split everything 50-50. The house, the savings, the retirement accounts. I think that's fair." Fair. The word tasted bitter in my mouth. Fair would have been having this conversation before I made the final payment. Fair would have been working on our marriage instead of working on her exit strategy. "I need some air," I said, grabbing my jacket from the hook by the door. This is a lot to process." "Mike, wait." But I was already walking out the door, my mind racing. As I got in my truck and started driving aimlessly through our neighborhood, I couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah's timing wasn't just cruel, it was strategic. And if there's one thing I learned from 25 years in construction, it's that when someone's being strategic, you better start building your own defenses. What I didn't tell Sarah, what she had no idea about, was that I'd already been building mine. 3 months earlier, I'd been working late in my home office trying to finish up some blueprints for a commercial project when Sarah's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She was in the shower, and normally I wouldn't have thought twice about it. But it had been buzzing all evening, and something about the pattern felt wrong. I glanced at the screen. David was calling. Again. David Morrison, her colleague from the insurance company. The same David she'd been having all those late meetings with. The same David whose name had started appearing in her conversations with increasing frequency, Over the past few months, I'm not a jealous man by nature, never have been. But when your wife starts working late 3 nights a week, starts talking about a coworker more than she talks to you, and starts treating you like a roommate instead of a husband, you start paying attention. The next morning, I did something I'd never done in 15 years of marriage. I looked through Sarah's phone while she was getting ready for work. What I found wasn't explicit. There were no love letters, no inappropriate photos. But there was something worse. Emotional intimacy, conversations about dreams, about feeling trapped, about wanting more from life. The kind of conversations she used to have with me. I feel like I'm living someone else's life, she'd texted David just 2 days earlier. Like I'm playing a role I never auditioned for. You deserve to be happy, Sarah, he'd replied. You deserve someone who sees you for who you really are. Sometimes I wonder what my life would look like if I just started over. Fresh slate, you know. I set the phone down with shaking hands. It wasn't just about David, though that was painful enough. It was about the realization that my wife had been planning her exit for months, maybe longer, and I'd been completely oblivious. That's when I started paying attention to other things. Like how she'd been insisting we put off any major purchases until we're in a better financial position. How she'd been encouraging me to make extra payments on the mortgage. How she'd been asking casual questions about our retirement accounts, our savings, our assets. I'm not a smart man when it comes to emotions, but I'm not stupid when it comes to money. And what I was seeing looked like someone getting ready to cash out. So I did what any reasonable person would do in that situation. I called my lawyer. Tom, I need some advice, I said when I reached Tom Bradley, the attorney who'd handled our house purchase 15 years ago. Hypothetically speaking, if someone was planning to divorce their spouse, would they wait until certain financial milestones were reached? Tom was quiet for a moment. Mike, is everything okay at home? Just answer the question, Tom. Well, hypothetically, he said carefully, if someone was planning to divorce, they might wait until marital assets were maximized. Paid off houses, vested retirement accounts, accumulated savings. More assets mean more to split. My blood ran cold. And hypothetically, what could someone do to protect themselves in that situation? That's a complicated question, Mike, but there are legal ways to protect assets, especially if you can prove they were acquired through individual effort, or if you have reason to believe the other party is acting in bad faith. I hung up the phone with a plan forming in my mind. If Sarah was playing chess, I needed to start thinking several moves ahead. The next day, I visited the county recorder's office. I'd like to make some changes to my property deed, I told the clerk. It was a simple process, really. The house had been purchased before our marriage, with money I'd saved from my previous job. Sarah's name had been added to the deed as a gesture of love and partnership. But in Colorado, I learned I had options. What I did next was completely legal, but it required careful timing and documentation. I consulted with Tom extensively, making sure every step was above board. I gathered financial records, traced the source of our down payment, documented the improvements I'd made to the house using my own labor and tools from my construction business. Most importantly, I waited. I waited and watched, hoping I was wrong about Sarah's intentions. Hoping she'd surprise me, choose our marriage over whatever escape fantasy she'd been building with David. But as the weeks passed and her behavior became more distant, more calculated, I knew I'd been right to prepare. The day I made the final mortgage payment, I also made one more trip to the recorder's office. By the time Sarah walked through our door with divorce papers in her purse, the legal groundwork was already in place. She thought she was playing chess, but she didn't realize I'd already moved my pieces, and the game was just getting started. 2 weeks after Sarah dropped the divorce bomb, we were sitting across from each other at the kitchen table that had hosted 15 years of family dinners, bill-paying sessions, and lazy Sunday morning coffee talks. Now it felt like a negotiation table, cold and formal, with a stack of legal documents between us like a barrier. "I've been thinking about what you said," I began, choosing my words carefully. "About splitting everything 50-50. Sarah's eyes lit up with what looked like relief. "I'm glad you're being reasonable about this, Mike. I know it's not easy, but I think it's the right thing to do." "Oh, I'm being very reasonable," I said, sliding a folder across the table. I had my lawyer draw up some papers. "Take a look." She opened the folder with the confidence of someone who thought they held all the cards. I watched her face as she read through the documents, watched as that confidence slowly transformed into confusion, then disbelief, then something approaching panic. "What is this?" she asked, her voice tight. "This says you're the sole owner of the house. That's not right. My name is on the deed." "Was on the deed," I corrected. "I made some changes a few months ago." "You can't do that. We're married. This is marital property." I leaned back in my chair, staying calm despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Actually, Sarah, I can do that." And I did. "You see, this house was purchased with my pre-marital savings. I added your name to the deed as a gift when we got married, but according to Colorado law, I had the right to remove it under certain circumstances." "What circumstances?" she demanded, her composed facade cracking. "Circumstances like discovering your emotional affair with David Morrison. Circumstances like realizing you've been planning this divorce for months while encouraging me to pay off the mortgage. Circumstances like finding out you've been using our marriage as a financial strategy." Sarah's face went white. "You went through my phone?" "I did. And I found very interesting conversations about starting over with a fresh slate, about feeling trapped in a life you never wanted, about deserving someone who sees you for who you really are." I pulled out printed copies of the text messages. "David seems like a real romantic. Shame he's also married." "Mike, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly. You've been planning your exit for months. You waited until the house was paid off because you thought you'd walk away with half its value. You filed for divorce on the exact day I made the final payment because you thought the timing would work in your favor." Sarah's hands were shaking as she stared at the documents. "This isn't fair. I've been part of this household for 15 years. I've contributed." "You've contributed," I agreed. "Your salary helped with utilities, groceries, day-to-day expenses. And you'll get credit for that in the divorce settlement. But this house was built with my sweat, my overtime, my sacrifices. Every extra payment came from construction bonuses. Every improvement was done with my own hands." I pulled out another folder, this one thick with financial records. Bank statements showing where every mortgage payment came from, receipts for materials I bought for renovations, time sheets showing the overtime I worked to pay down the principal faster, tax returns showing the income sources. Sarah's lawyer was going to have a field day with this, but not in the way she expected. You can't just take everything," she said, her voice small now, defeated. "I'm not taking everything. I'm keeping what's mine. The house was mine before we got married, and it's mine now. You'll get half of the actual marital assets, the savings account, the retirement funds that accumulated during our marriage, your car, your personal belongings. That's not enough I can't afford to buy another house with just that. Maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to blow up our marriage for your coworker." I stood up, suddenly exhausted by the whole conversation. "David's welcome to help you figure out your housing situation. I'm sure he's got some great ideas about fresh starts. Mike, please, can we talk about this? Maybe we can work something out." I looked at my wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, and felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. "Sarah, we could have worked something out 15 years ago. We could have worked something out last year or 6 months ago, or even 3 months ago when you started planning your exit strategy. But you chose to make this a business transaction, so let's treat it like one." I headed toward the door, then turned back. "Oh, and Sarah, you might want to let David know that his wife Karen might be interested in seeing those text messages. I haven't decided yet whether to share them, but I'm leaning toward the full transparency approach these days." The look of horror on her face told me everything I needed to know about how much she'd considered the collateral damage of her choices. As I walked out of the house that was now legally, indisputably mine, I felt something I hadn't felt in months, a sense of control over my own life. But the real surprise was still coming, because what happened in court a month later shocked even her lawyer. The courthouse in downtown Denver was unusually busy for a Tuesday morning, filled with the usual mix of lawyers, defendants, and people like me, ordinary folks trying to untangle the messes their lives had become. Sarah sat across the aisle, with her attorney, a sharp-dressed woman named Patricia Winters, who had a reputation for being ruthless in divorce proceedings. I sat with Tom Bradley, my lawyer, feeling surprisingly calm for someone whose 15-year marriage was about to be officially dissolved. Tom had prepared me for what to expect, but he'd also prepared a few surprises that Sarah's team didn't see coming. "Your Honor," Patricia Winters began when our case was called, "my client is seeking an equitable distribution of marital assets. While we acknowledge that Mr. Thompson has made certain technical changes to the property deed, we believe the family home should still be considered marital property subject to division." Judge Martinez, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, looked over her glasses at the paperwork in front of her. "I've reviewed the initial filings. Mr. Bradley, how does your client respond to this claim?" Tom stood up with the confidence of someone who'd been practicing family law for 30 years. "Your Honor, we have extensive documentation proving that the property in question was purchased entirely with my client's premarital assets. Additionally, we have evidence that Mrs. Thompson was engaged in an extramarital affair while simultaneously encouraging her husband to accelerate mortgage payments with the apparent intent of maximizing her potential settlement." "That's speculation," Patricia interjected. "And we dispute the characterization of my client's relationship with her colleague as an affair." "We have text messages," Tom replied calmly, producing a thick folder. Hundreds of them spanning several months. Messages in which Mrs. Thompson discusses her plans to leave the marriage, her emotional connection to another man, and her specific interest in ensuring certain financial milestones were reached before filing for divorce. Judge Martinez held up her hand. "I'll review the evidence. But first, let me address the property issue. Mr. Bradley, you're claiming the house is separate property." "That's correct, Your Honor. Purchased in 2008 with funds from my client's previous employment before the marriage. Mrs. Thompson's name was added to the deed as a gift, but Colorado law allows for the removal of a spouse's name under certain circumstances, particularly when there's evidence of bad faith or fraud. And you believe those circumstances exist here?" "We do, Your Honor. The evidence shows a pattern of deceptive behavior designed to maximize my client's financial exposure while Mrs. Thompson planned her exit from the marriage." This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The moment when all of Sarah's careful planning would finally be exposed for what it was. Patricia Winters tried to object, but Judge Martinez was already reviewing the text messages Tom had submitted. The courtroom was quiet except for the sound of papers rustling and the judge's occasional as she read. After what felt like an eternity, Judge Martinez looked up. "Mrs. Thompson, I've reviewed these communications. Would you like to explain to the court why you were discussing divorce plans with a third party while simultaneously encouraging your husband to pay off the marital residence?" Sarah's face went pale. "Your Honor, The timing wasn't intentional. I was confused about my feelings, and David was just a friend who was helping me work through things. A married friend with whom you were discussing intimate details of your marriage and your plans to end it. It wasn't like that. Mrs. Thompson, the judge's voice carried a sharp edge. I've been doing this for 22 years. I know what an exit strategy looks like, and I know what bad faith looks like. The question is whether you do. Patricia Winters leaned over to whisper something to Sarah, but the damage was already done. Furthermore, Judge Martinez continued, I've reviewed the financial records submitted by Mr. Thompson's attorney, the mortgage payments, the property improvements, the source of funds for the down payment. This is clearly separate property that was improved and maintained through individual effort and premarital assets. She set the papers down and looked directly at Sarah. Mrs. Thompson, your behavior as documented in these communications suggests a deliberate attempt to maximize your financial position at your husband's expense. The court finds this particularly troubling, given that you were simultaneously encouraging the very financial decisions that you now claim entitle you to a larger settlement. Your Honor, Patricia tried one more time. My client contributed to the household for 15 years. And she'll be compensated for her legitimate contributions. Judge Martinez cut her off. But she won't be rewarded for deceptive behavior. The final ruling was swift and decisive. I kept the house, all of it. Sarah got half of the actual marital assets, the savings account, half the value of the cars, and half of the retirement funds that had accumulated during our marriage. It was fair, but it wasn't the windfall she'd been planning for. As we left the courthouse, I could see Patricia Winters having what looked like a very uncomfortable conversation with her client. Tom and I walked to the parking garage in comfortable silence. You know, Tom said as we reached my truck, in 30 years of family law, I've never seen someone scheme backfire quite so spectacularly. What do you mean? Think about it, Mike. If Sarah had just been honest about wanting a divorce 6 months ago, she might have had a legitimate claim to part of the house's value. But by being deceptive, by planning and scheming, she actually weakened her legal position. The judge saw right through it. I thought about that as I drove home to my house for the first time as a single man. Sarah's betrayal had hurt, but her deception had actually protected me from a much worse outcome. 3 weeks later, I heard through mutual friends that David Morrison's wife had filed for divorce too, after someone had anonymously sent her copies of his text messages with Sarah. Apparently, David's fresh start philosophy didn't extend to taking care of his own family's financial security during his midlife crisis. Sarah moved into a small apartment across town. I heard she was working extra hours at the insurance company, trying to save up for a down payment on a condo. The irony wasn't lost on me. She was now in the same position I'd been in 23 years ago, starting from scratch and making sacrifices to build toward home ownership. As for me, I'm still in the house, still working construction, still making improvements with my own hands. But now I'm building something different, not just a home, but a life based on honesty and hard work, rather than schemes and deception. Sometimes I wonder if Sarah ever realized that her perfect timing was actually the worst possible timing. That by waiting for the house to be paid off, she'd given me time to discover her plans and protect myself. That her calculated approach to ending our marriage had actually calculated her right out of the very thing she'd been scheming to get. They say the house always wins, but in this case, the house stayed with the person who'd been honest about wanting to keep it. And sometimes, late at night when I'm sitting on that wraparound porch, I can't help but smile at the poetic justice of it all. Sarah thought she was playing chess, but she forgot the most important rule of the game. Always assume your opponent is smarter than they look.